Good morning. Sorry I'm a minute or two late. I hope some of you were able to come last night to the Women's Appreciation Dinner. If you did, I hope you enjoyed it. I know the men enjoyed serving the women, and it's always a good time, so hope you did enjoy that last night. This quarter, we in this class has been studying in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. There have been lots of interesting things for us to learn in these two books. And hopefully we'll continue to learn as we finish this quarter up this month. So we are in the book of Nehemiah. If you'd like to be turning, we're going to be in chapter 6 today. We're going to go through chapter 6 and a little bit into chapter 7. And today we're looking at Nehemiah's finishing the wall. Remember, the people in exile had been taken away into Babylon. Then Babylonians were conquered by the Persians. And King Cyrus agreed to start sending groups back to Jerusalem to start rebuilding, first of all, the temple, and then with Nehemiah's group, he was the cupbearer of Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes sent Nehemiah back to help rebuild and restore the wall surrounding Jerusalem. So once they got there, just in a little bit of review, these exiles that were coming back, these Jews that were coming back from captivity into the land, encountered lots of opposition. They had opponents, in this case in Nehemiah and the whole Jewish nation. We talked last week, last couple of weeks, some of the things these opponents had tried to slow down Nehemiah's success and the Jews' success into, in this case, rebuilding of the wall. Let's mention some of those things that they had tried. Anybody remember some of those tactics that the opponents tried to slow them down?
I think they tried to notify the leaders of the Persians that the wall was being rebuilt so that they could probably try and convince the Persians that they're in a state of rebellion.
Okay, so they were sending lies back to the king of Persia that the Jews were rebuilding this wall in an attempt to come back and overthrow or reestablish themselves separate from Persia. And that's part of our lesson today, is the degree with which that took place. But that had always been, the people of the land wanted to subvert what the king of Persia had agreed to do and started spreading lies. And they were looking back in the past at what the Jews had done previously. When they built the wall, they had their own kings, and they refused to pay tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar came in, wiped them out, took them into captivity. So these people that are opponents are going back to ancient history, so to speak, and to try to bring up these concerns. They really, more than anything, to slow the people down. So what else had they tried? Y'all remember what else we talked about?
They run the mountain down the work that was done at the wall.
Yeah, if a fox jumped on it, it would knock it down. So they mocked them, didn't they? It was they tried to use mockery against the people to try to discourage them. You know, if you're building this wall, it's so flimsy. If a fox jumps on it, it'll knock it down. I believe that was maybe Tobiah, and then Sanballat talked about, and he was mocking them and saying, "You're just going to come in. All these stones are burned in these heaps of rubble, and you expect to build another wall out of this." So there's lots of mockery going on. So they tried that first, trying to, I guess, get in the minds of these workers to try to discourage them, slow them down, make them give up hope, I guess. So that was another challenge or another method of trying to discourage them. What else did they try? Y'all remember? Threat of violence. They started this, they had this, whether it was a rumor or not, they started the rumor, and they were starting this conspiracy with lots of the people that were there in the area that were there when the exiles came in. We're talking about Sanballat was one of the area governors, Tobiah, Geshem, and it says the army of Samaria. Basically, that was made up of a lot of the Edomites and the Ashdodites and the Ammonites and some of those people, Arabs, basically. It says Arabs, which are the people south and east of Jerusalem. So they were starting this conspiracy thinking, well, if we attack them or at least threaten to attack them, then they won't be able to finish the project. They'll get very discouraged. So you remember, and we're going to see some of this week, and what Nehemiah's response was to this. And we talked about maybe even our New Testament application. He prayed first. So first of all, prayed. We're going to see almost every opposition that he faced. First thing he does is pray. In this case, in the threat of violence, he set up guards at the wall. He had people, as they were working in shifts. Some were guards. People were working with the swords by their sides. The families were responsible for their area of the wall to watch out for and be on the lookout. That was the other thing we learned. You got to be on the lookout for, in our application, be on the lookout for Satan and his attempts to slow us down. Some of the other things there, besides that, he made sure that he had somebody next to him with a trumpet. So they had, if there ever was a problem or where the enemy would come and attack, they'd blow the trumpet and everybody would respond to that area to defend it. So through that, when his enemies found out that Nehemiah knew of what was going on, they backed down. So, that was our application, be able to look out for Satan's wiles, for those people who are doing Satan's bidding while we're trying. There's always a spiritual battle going on, spiritual battle today, so be on the lookout. Use and wear the armor of God in our day-to-day lives. The other thing we saw a little bit of last week is this economic pressure that was brought to bear in the opposition. And a lot of the economic pressure was internal, where we remember there's a famine, and there were the Jews, the Jews that were struggling to even feed their families were taking loans. They were mortgaging their lands to the wealthier Jews, and the wealthier Jews were taking advantage of the situation. So Nehemiah came in, he called them down, and he made sure that they understood. Nehemiah said, Nehemiah apparently was wealthy. He said, we have purchased the freedom of our brethren from this captivity, and we have moved here, and yet we are continuing to put our brethren under our thumb, where people can't even live and eat and feed their children without selling them into slavery. So he basically shamed them for what they were doing. And they all realized that once he gave his speech, and so they agreed and restored what they had taken from the poor people. And going forward then, hopefully that was going to help them get through the famine, get through the difficult times they were having. But none of this had worked, this opposition to the building of the wall. None of it worked. The only trick the opponents had left was treachery. So the people in the land that had been there, they were old hands of the region around Jerusalem. And here Nehemiah and the Jews were newcomers into the area. They were thinking, well, it shouldn't be too difficult to trick them. And so the Jews were having success building the wall. But all that Nehemiah at this point seemed to lack were the hanging of the gates of the city. So Sanballat and Tobiah and the rest of the enemies, they had reason to be concerned because all this project is about to be finished, and they're about to hang the gates to the city. They couldn't deny that Artaxerxes, king of Persia, was really favored Nehemiah because he had sent Nehemiah. Nehemiah had been his cupbearer. They could only carry their opposition so far because of their favor with king. But if they could get Nehemiah at some point to meet them at some neutral side or side away from the city, then perhaps they could kill them and tell the emperor whatever they wanted to tell him. So there's nothing then at that point Artaxerxes would be able to do. So it sounded like a good plan to these opponents, to these enemies, but like the others, it didn't work. So we're going to read on our lesson today about that. So the Jews really must have been excited at this point. They've got the walls going up, the project is coming together, it's coming to an end, this big project, but now even the enemies must have realized that, okay, the wall is going to be completed. So it seemed like at this point then perhaps these opponents would be willing to negotiate a peace. This project really had taken away the disgrace that had been brought upon Jerusalem with all of the devastation and destruction. But so now, though, the wall's coming up around their city, and they're going to have their own governor, Nehemiah, who was established by the king of Persia. But Sanballat and the others, they wanted to change their stance regarding the city, I guess in trickery. That's what Nehemiah thought was they wanted to change their stance. So the Jewish opponents sent word to Nehemiah suggesting that he meet with them in one of the villages on the banks of the Ono River. But they only had the details left to work out. But Nehemiah thought about the matter, and he refused to take the bait. He would not meet with them on the banks of the Ono or anywhere else. And he knew the ways that they were using to trick them. He knew their ways, these provincial governors, very well. So he sent word back to Sanballat that he was too busy. So the work of the king of Persia had to be completed. It would just be a waste of time to leave that work and to come attend a meeting. So his answer back to Sanballat and the others was just on the edge of being insulting. So he said, why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? So 3 more times Sanballat sent the invitation, and the Samaritan governor, he was really desperate to have a favorable answer from Nehemiah. But 3 more times Nehemiah refused. So Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, and the others realized they had to have a drastic change in plans in order to be successful. So clearly Nehemiah was not going to leave the project in the safety of Jerusalem and come to meet them at some city near the river of Ono. So these enemies decided, well, maybe a public invitation might be better. So these opponents knew they had allies in the Jewish camp. There were some Jews that were sympathetic, and they had allies. If they could just get Nehemiah to meet them in the temple, then perhaps he would feel safer. But some of the allies in Jerusalem, they were going to help him do that. And with the help of friends, they could kill him there at the temple. But with that revision, they continued with their plans to try to slow down, try to kill Nehemiah. And that's kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. So let's look at chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. And I do apologize if I stumble on some of these names through our text. They can be a little tongue-twisting. So let's look at chapter 6, and we're going to read 1 through 9. Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall, and this is Nehemiah speaking and writing, and that there were no breaks left in it, though at the time I had not hung the doors to the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, "Come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono." They thought to do me harm, so I sent messengers to them, saying, "I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you?" But they sent me this message 4 times, and I answered them in the same manner. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me as before, the 5th time, with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, "It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says, that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. And you also have appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, 'There is a king in Judah.' Now these matters will be reported to the king. So come, therefore, and let us consult together." Then I sent to him, saying, "No such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart." For they all were trying to make us afraid, saying, "Their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will not be done." Now, therefore, O God, strengthen my hand. So, in this first section, Sanballat and his friends, they adjusted their plan enough to make Nehemiah believe that they had some things that they could do for him. So Artaxerxes, previously, he would not have allowed even the trusted cupbearer to set himself up as an independent king. So there's no way that Artaxerxes would let Nehemiah set himself up as a king. But the Jews that surrounded him would have no better success with withstanding the emperor of Persia than they did with withstanding king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, when they previously were taken away. So Sanballat sent a 5th time to meet Nehemiah. So this time it was a longer letter. It was notable for what it was suggesting rather than what it actually said. So the quote there is, "I'm afraid the word will get out," Sanballat wrote. "It is already known among the nations around here. My friend Geshem says that you are trying to set yourself up as king among the Jews. Not that I believe it myself, but you have to be careful. They say you are building a wall around Jerusalem so you can be king. Not only that, you have hired 2 prophets to support you. If these prophets are anything like prophets before them, there is a streak of nationalism in their message. Whether it's true or not, will they say, there is a king in Judah. If word of this gets to Artaxerxes, there's no telling what he will do." So he's acting like he's giving Nehemiah a favor. He's saying, "Look, I've heard these things. It's just what I've heard. I don't know that it's really true or not, but you need to be aware of what's being said." So there's enough truth in what Sanballat was telling Nehemiah to really give Nehemiah a little pause, or any governor a pause, about what actually might be told to Artaxerxes, how Artaxerxes would take it. You know, these lies are being told, but there's just enough truth in it for Nehemiah perhaps to be concerned. So Nehemiah already lacked that full support. The wealthier people didn't necessarily endorse Nehemiah and what he was doing. But in his meeting with nobles, remember last week, and the rulers of the Jews, when he was calling them on the carpet about taking advantage of the poorer Jews, that it really was enough there that he lacked did not have the unanimous support of everybody. So perhaps he thinks he had been too hasty. You know, some of his friends he thought were saying as much and believing some of these lies that Sanballat was saying. So, but we see there Nehemiah, how he responded to this continuing lies that were being told. Number one, Nehemiah said, "There's no truth in what you're saying." He said, "What you're saying is just a bunch of lies." Number two, your only objective is to scare us into submission. So he understood what was going on in this attempt to slow him down and to attack Nehemiah and make him look bad in the people's eyes and the king's eyes. Any comments before we go on to the next section? So he took Solomon's advice. He didn't get distracted. He didn't listen to the advice of a fool. He didn't get distracted from the focus on what he was doing on the project, did he? Very good. Let's look then Nehemiah 6, verses 10 through 14. Afterward I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delilah, the son of Mehetabel, who was a secret informer. And he said, "Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. Indeed, at night they will come to kill you." And I said, "Should such a man as I flee? And who is there who would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in." Then I perceived that God had not sent him at all, but that he pronounced his prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this reason he was hired, that I should be afraid and act that way and sin, so that they may have cause for an evil report, that they might reproach me. My God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid. So Nehemiah, by this time, again, he did not have that universal support of the people. He seems to expect that there were spies among his group that were sympathetic to the enemy. Shemaiah was one of them, and Noadiah was the other we see in these verses. Presumably Shemaiah was one of those nobles and rulers who had opposed Nehemiah, who maybe was part of that group that he reprimanded last week. Shemaiah had said, "I will arrange a meeting in the house of God, in the temple between you, Sanballat, and the others. We both know they are trying to kill you, so we will bolt the doors. Whether you meet in the day or night makes no difference. They want you dead." So Nehemiah told Shemaiah, basically, take back this message to Sanballat. So Nehemiah said, "Should such a man as I flee? And who is there such as I who would go into the temple to save his life?" So the Jewish governor, Nehemiah, had too much self-respect and to flee from his enemies and to hide out in the temple. He knew he had God's support, but in this, there's a difference between his self-respect and standing strong and arrogance that he did not show this arrogance, but it was this self-respect and confidence that he had. So he refused to meet with his enemies under any conditions. And as Nehemiah thought about it, he thought, Shemaiah, he's only pretending to have this message from God to do this. He has really been hired by Sanballat and Tobiah as a spy. So all this had been part of the plot to make him afraid, Nehemiah afraid. So really it's to bring the reproach against him. So going back and kind of rehashing, bringing in to this week's lesson and some of those that we talked about before and even a little earlier. So what did Nehemiah do? He came under attack by his enemies with this threat of exposure. There's a lot of lies and saying, well, just come to the temple and meet us. That's a safe public place. But he knew it was not. He knew they were there to attack him, to kill him. So what did Nehemiah do? And what would that lesson be for us again today?
He didn't go to the temple like this man had suggested that he do. Would do. He also perceived that the man was really a spy sent in to convince him to do the wrong thing. And of course, I don't know if the text talks about Nehemiah's tribal background, but he would not have had potentially authority to go in the temple in the way that this man suggested.
Okay. So you said it. I can't say it any better than what you said. So he didn't follow the advice of this man. Based on his background, perhaps he was not a Levite. He would not have been authorized to enter the temple in this way, and it would have been reproached about doing that. So he didn't listen to them. He, just like before, he did not listen to the insults, the mockery, so he ignored them. And he knew that it was going to be bad if he listened to them and went into the temple. He also, in the scriptures, he prayed. So that was one of the first things he did. We talked about that previously. He prayed when he came under attack. He continued to work, continued to focus on his work. He refused this plot. He refused to be sidetracked, to listen to these temptations, to these other things he knew that were not right. And he focused and he saw this completion of the wall to be finished. So with the support of the emperor and the help of God, he was sure to succeed. So some of those elements we've already talked about. And we can take application today as we come under attack and as we come under temptation to go to God in prayer, to try to ignore those things, those temptations and those attacks, and stay focused on what we're to be about in God's work, because we know with God's help and His strength that we find in Him, we're sure to succeed. And our goal is not something physical, as Nehemiah's goal was to build the wall. Our goal is spiritual, and that to attain heaven, to live our lives according to God's will, and to attain heaven. So there are lots of lessons we can learn here. Yes, sir. It's very well said. So Nehemiah, in the physical sense, was protected by being in Jerusalem and within the city gates and within the city wall as a protection from those enemies that would cause him harm if he were to go outside. Parallel today, within the church, we find protection and within a spiritual body from Satan. And if we leave the church, if we leave the confines, or as we leave the confines of going out into the world, we're going to be subject to Satan's attempts to tempt us, to lead us astray. So that's why it's so important to meet as a group of Christians, meet in this area together. We have something in common. We have protection, so to speak, perhaps in those outside influences of Satan. We gather around, we get strengthened through gathering around, having fellowship around the Lord's Supper table and remembering what God has done for us, what Jesus has done for us. And it's just important for us to remember how important it is to meet together as God's family, and what protection that gives us, what encouragement that gives us, because we will, as we live our lives in the world, we're going to be attacked by Satan and what his temptations are. So that was a good parallel. Okay, let's look then the rest of the text today. We are looking at, we're going to read verse 15, and we'll read verse 15 through into chapter 7, verse 3. So chapter 6, verse 15. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. And it happened when all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations around us saw these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that the work was done by our God. Also in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and the letters of Tobiah came to them. For many in Judah were pledged to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Era, and his son Jehohanan, and married the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. Also they reported his good deeds before me, and reported my words to him. Tobiah sent letters to frighten me. Then it was when the wall, chapter 7, then it was when the wall was built, and I had hung the doors, when the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed, that I gave the charge of Jerusalem to my brother Hanani, and Hananiah the leader of the citadel, for he was a faithful man, and feared God more than many. And I said to them, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot, and while they stand guard, let them shut and bar the doors, and appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, one at his watch station and another in front of his own house. So in this section then we see that it only took 52 days to rebuild the wall. In our minds, that seems like a short amount of time, but it was really a daunting task to how many people they had working. It really had been accomplished more quickly than anybody really thought it might, but they realized God was with them. And from the previous destruction, there's some that think that that the destruction by Nebuchadnezzar, there still may have been part of that old wall that was left standing that they could have used for a base, but the breaches and the big holes and all that had to be repaired, and it had to be built up again, and toppers of various heights, the wall built up and finished out. But still, the Jews with Nehemiah, they may not have had to build the entire wall from scratch all the way around the city, but when the walls were completed, the enemies of the Jews really were disheartened, and Nehemiah's prestige grew at that point in the view of the Jews. Mentions here the month of Elul. It was a Babylonian month. It really fell in late summer, early fall of the year, and we had talked about calendars before, about how most all ancient peoples used a calendar of some kind. The names of the seasons and the months differed widely, but they were all important as they were keeping their calendar to recognize events and celebrations. While Nehemiah, though, he had kept his record, his chronicle, he described all this power to the opposition, and at this time, though, he describes the depth of Tobiah's influence. Remember Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, and then some of the other oppositions he's been dealing with. But in this text, it talks about Tobiah and what his interaction has been, why he was such a formidable foe. So Tobiah had been an Ammonite. He's closely related to many of the people that were in the land of Israel. And the presence of Tobiah is a reminder that even after many years, the Jews continued to be a part of the people who lived in the vicinity of Jerusalem. So many of the Jews had expressed their loyalty to Tobiah. He and his family, they were intermarried with many of the returnees. So when Nehemiah finished the wall, it was a great deal of correspondence that took place between Tobiah and his allies within the camp of the Jews. So Nehemiah had to be on his guard. He had to continually watch for threats and the Jews in the city, and any opportunity Tobiah or his allies might take to tear down internally, physically, Nehemiah and the Jews who are trying to do the right thing. So Nehemiah put his brother Hanani and a trusted companion, Hananiah, in charge of the city's security. So these loyal men, they were put in charge to guard those vulnerable sections of the wall, and they were stationed near their own homes as much as possible. So they were continuing to keep this keep a watchful eye toward any possibility of attack to come on the city. But when you think about all the internal strife and internal relationships of Tobiah and some of the Jews, it can be difficult. I'm sure Nehemiah found it difficult sometimes to identify who was really on his side and who wasn't. Obviously, Tobiah was not, because there were a lot of heated letters back and forth. Tobiah was writing letters to his allies that were trying to discourage Nehemiah, to tear Nehemiah down, to tear down his influence. So Nehemiah really had to keep a watchful eye for any other threats that were coming along. So it's really interesting. I find this work of Nehemiah and Ezra before him, as far as interesting and inspiring of these Old Testament stories. We see that Nehemiah, where he came from, he was the cupbearer of Artaxerxes, and all this process that had taken place in the story that we've read. But he's by no means through with the story. Even once the wall was built, the last brick in place, last stone in place, the gates hung, he still had to govern the city. He was still the governor put in place by Artaxerxes. So he still had a lot of things left to do. So we'll see next week the start of Ezra's involvement. So we haven't talked at this point about what Ezra's been doing, and we'll look at that next week, because Ezra was an expert in the law of Moses. He was a scribe. He was instrumental in bringing the people back to God, to bringing the worship back, serving God according to what God had described, according to the law of Moses, of what God's wishes were. So we're going to look at that next week. But the energies of the people, at this point, they were all focused on building the wall. But even with the walls completed, the Jews were a long way from that kind of obedience to God that would give them that peace and security that he had seen in other times in the Old Testament. When they were following God, he protected them, he gave them peace, he gave them security. So they're a long way from that at this point. But Nehemiah's job, in large part, is about completed. But Ezra's, as far as the spiritual side and his spiritual guidance, was just beginning at this point. So there's a connection between the events of the people in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and the events to come involving Jesus in the New Testament. We're reading in Matthew's genealogy. Remember the genealogy of Christ in the book of Matthew? Zerubbabel is in that genealogy. Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, son of Jeconiah, whom the Jews considered the last legitimate king. So Zerubbabel, it's the same Zerubbabel that, along with Jeshua the priest, they had come. They led that first contingency of the Jews back to Jerusalem. They rebuilt that second temple. And then regarding the temple, they built that temple. And then Herod the Great was the same king who killed the infants around Bethlehem. He was a very rich man, but he expanded that second temple and made it one of the most impressive buildings in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. It really was the focal point of Judaism in the time of Jesus, and it stood there until the Romans destroyed it in AD 70. And for a time after that, Jews were forbidden to live there, and Jerusalem became really a thoroughly Gentile city. But before the Romans destroyed it, and all these things working up, laying the foundation to Jesus, to the Christ coming. And we read then in the New Testament of Jesus' life, his teachings, and the crucifixion there in and around Jerusalem. So we're we're getting a story in this Old Testament of groundwork that's being laid, that God is laying, and the genealogy that God is putting in place to ultimately bring Christ to the world. And we see that through Zerubbabel and his participation in this returning of the exiles. Anybody have any other comments this morning? Thank you for making comments. Next week again, we're going to be looking at Ezra and his spiritual leadership. And that will be, I believe, starting in chapter 8. So if you want to prepare a little bit in advance, if you want to read chapter 8 in Nehemiah. Anybody else have any other comments before we close? Thank you again for your participation. I really appreciate it. Great comments this morning. And I hope you got something out of the lesson, because there are a lot of great examples we have in Ezra and Nehemiah. Thank you.